I've been involved in digital humanities before it was called digital humanities, really from the early 90s. And one of the things that I've noticed as the field has developed, sometimes to my chagrin, and I'm not alone in this, is that often you see digital humanists who are find cool tools and are looking for something to do with them. And you often find, not always, but I mean too often, I think, find work that doesn't really have a research question or work that's searching for a research question. I think one of the interesting things about Henry's work is that there's a research question that's sort of at the heart of it, and that the tools that he's using are being used to answer that question. And of course, that opens up then a whole other set of questions which probably wouldn't be possible without that. Anyway, so I'm really excited to give a talk. Marcus, if you want to do the more formal academic.
Absolutely, yeah. In formally introducing Dr. Henry Lovejoy, I'm going to rely on the tradition of singing one's praises. And typically, in these situations, at least in the West African context, it's usually the younger who sings the praises of the elder. We're going to flip this a little bit. I got a few years on Henry, I think. But as you know, I'm just going to highlight a little bit, just some segments of his scholarship, and I think that lends some insight into how he's really pushing himself into that category of a scholarly elder, for sure. Professor Lovejoy received his PhD from UCLA in 2012. He's currently assistant professor at the University of Colorado in lovely Boulder. And some notable publications. He came out with a really wonderful book, Prieto, late last year, early this year. Late last year. Has an upcoming edited volume on liberated Africans, as well, coming out very soon. In addition to the books, he has published in really notable journals such as Slavery and Abolition and the Journal of African History, the Canadian Journal of African Studies, African Economic History, among others. His digital projects include websites. He's the director of slaveryimages.org. He's the creator and director of Liberated Africans, among a number of digital projects that he's been involved in. So with that said, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Lovejoy. Thank you for coming. Thanks to all for coming.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me here and the invitation. And really had a great time at the Brown Bag Lunch for those of you who attended. So I'm going to begin my talk today. When I was about 11 or 12 years old, my dad took me up to northern Nigeria. And when I was there, what really stood out to me as a young child was the drumming and dancing. And this really had a very big impact on my life because, we went up to Kano and Zaria and even as far as Maiduguri, and I saw this drumming all over the place. And I remember meeting one of these drum masters, and he was very, very tall to me at that time. And, he came and talked to me and he said, these drums that I play are talking drums. And, so I asked him, what do they say? And he's like, well, that's a secret. So I couldn't get much more out of him, as, talking drummers like to do in ritualized context. So, by the time I was in college, I had been playing hand drums for quite some time. And in my last summer before my senior year, I went off to Cuba. And I went into a neighborhood of Kohimar, which is the same neighborhood that Hemingway wrote about in The Old Man and the Sea. And when I was there, I went there with about $500 in my pocket. I was going to jam out with some musicians and some more drumming. That ran out pretty quickly, so I was sort of taken around places. Didn't know where I was going because I had failed Spanish in my undergraduate years. So, I spent about 3 months there, so I was picking up some Spanish, and they took me to this garage where I saw some more drums. And they told me that these were tambores que hablan, talking drums. But here I kind of stopped and I listened, and I really tried to figure out what these secrets were that they were trying to tell us. So the talking drums that I had seen in Nigeria, northern Nigeria, were different than the ones that I saw in Cuba. But they also told me in Cuba that these talking drums also came from Nigeria. And so this really kind of fueled my research interests, which is what's leading me up into the talk today. So the ones that I saw in Cuba were really these bata drums. So you can kind of see the difference between the dum-dum. And these replicate the tones of languages, of African languages. They tell stories about history, migration, memories, legacies, lots of really interesting things that are really dependent on what the drummers want to convey. So you can kind of really see the similarities between the two, right? So there's this clear diasporic linkage that came across the Atlantic. So the roots really of these drums in Cuba go back to what is now modern-day Nigeria. They're super identifiable. As you can see, there's a trio of drums, small, medium, and large, hourglass-shaped, double-headed. So when they're played in unison, it really replicates the language. And this is sort of a form of literacy that is very prevalent among peoples with non-written histories. So very, very important culturally, historically, and really convey a lot of all of these things. So to follow this migration, because this is exactly what my master's thesis was to begin with, was following these drums from Africa to the Americas. And it's since morphed into a much larger project, as these things tend to do, because it's not really the drums that I was following, it was the people. Right? The drummers who brought this knowledge with them to Cuba. How to make them, how to play them. And so I began using digital technologies to sort of trace this diasporic thread of a migration. So in order to do this, we have to actually go back in time. And this is where mapping kind of comes into things. So what I'm really showing you here is sort of the different ways in which Africa has been represented cartographically. Right? So you have the modern day map, which we're all very familiar with, but just over 100 years ago, Africa looked completely different in the colonial periods. So the 1913 map, the blue is what the territories of France, the peachy pink is British, and so on and so forth. And then the 1880 map is sort of just before the colonial period. And these are just maps I randomly took off the internet. And I think this is a major problem when you're trying to teach or explain pre-colonial African history, because these maps, as you can see, in just basically 120, 40-year period, completely different from one another. And so you have to kind of go back and think about maps in a different way. And this problem really originates because Africa hasn't been mapped out by Africans at all, and especially in the pre-colonial period. So here's a very early map of Africa where they first came out with sort of the shape of the continent, very fantastical imagery with the Cyclops in the region that I'm studying. So these things are very different. You can move it along. So by the late 16th century, mid to late 16th century, Europeans have begun talking with people like, you might be familiar with Leo Africanus, San. And so this is sort of a northward looking south. A lot of these toponyms that are inland sort of come from these oral descriptions of what Africa was like. And a lot of those got more complicated, just about 100 years later. So here we are with another map, a lot of sort of made up places that are inland, but they've been kind of carried over from the earlier periods. Keep moving along, even by the late 18th century. They still didn't even know the Niger River, the course of it had not been mapped out on maps. So they actually thought that the Niger River went all the way over to the Nile, which of course we now know is not true. But these were some of the prevalent theories of Europeans who were mapping out Africa in the pre-colonial period. So really by 1851, we're starting to get a little more realism in terms of where these locations, these inland bodies of water and so on and so forth, really began to take shape. So when we're talking about pre-colonial Africa, this is a major hole in the scholarship. It's a major hole in terms of what we understand internally of what's going on. It's not because people couldn't map. It's not that Africans didn't know their geography. Of course they did. If you lived near the Niger, you knew where it was. It had a different name. It wasn't called the Niger, depending on your culture. So all of a sudden, we have this problem because we don't have this documented cartographic history, this especially in the pre-colonial period. So what I've really begun to do using GIS and R is I really wanted to show the transformation that was undergoing. So this is in the late 18th century, and then by 1850, you can see this massive political change that takes place. Right? So we can go back and forth, and what I'm really doing is because I know that the bata drums came from Oyo. They're a year of the drum. They're dedicated to the prevailing god of this kingdom, Shango. They are considered to be the drums of Shango. And Oyo, this pre-colonial state, major slave trading state for hundreds of years, underwent collapse over basically a 21-year period, 1817 to 1836. So during this collapse, which was through a series of intertwined conflicts, including jihad, a constitutional crisis, foreign invasions, civil war, very, very complicated history. Right? As any state that undergoes a major collapse requires. Right? And it's going to involve lots of factors that are taking place. What really happened, because in the historiography we had these two maps. And you can see Sokoto Caliphate, it became one of the biggest pre-colonial states in all of West Africa. About the size of France, if you want to think of it that way. So it became this massive state, and it arose in the same way of independence movements, although completely different. It was an overthrow of aristocracy and jihad. And this spread out, and a lot of people in Oyo had been enslaving Muslims in the north and putting them on slave ships. So they went to war against Oyo, and this really caused a series of events that resulted in the collapse of the state. So, as I discussed in the brown bag lunch, these are some of the maps I've been making with GIS. And I'll get to the heat map in a second, but what I essentially have done is I've gone through the available primary sources, a lot of the secondary sources that interpret the primary sources over the decades. And I began mapping out, town by town, when war and conflict occurred at a particular place, when there wasn't conflict, when a place was destroyed, or perhaps when a new place was found. So I was really interested in just sort of this geo-referenceable data that was prevalent in the scholarship, that was organized into paragraphs, scouring through it over several years and putting it into a database of about 500 towns that are referenced in the literature. And so I began to do that, map out some of the borders around some of these states. It had been done in the secondary sources that I was looking at. So I was using a lot of the similar boundaries that I had seen. You know, this is not always how Africans would think of their territorial extents of the kingdom, but this is something that is very teachable because you can visualize and see where these boundaries lie. So all of these towns existed at one point or another. They may not today, because this was also a period of intense urbanization. So this is where major cities like Ibadan formed, Abeokuta. These are major Nigerian cities today. Okay? Because as all of these towns were being attacked, people consolidated into larger communities to protect themselves. So up here you can see sort of the states, and then I have sort of a little legend for conflict. Because at certain moments in time, I can say that this place was undergoing a war or a conflict. Maybe it was destroyed, the town was destroyed at different periods. And so you can begin to assign a subjective scale to some of this data. So I would use 0 that a place wasn't attacked. There's no warfare going on. 1 would be some conflict, 2 would be the destruction of a place, and then I jump all the way to 9 for the foundation of a new town. Just leaving everything open in case I want to complicate this more later down the road. So I began doing all of this. I also was able to make access of information related to the Voyages database, which Rebecca Shumway is a part of. And so this down here at the bottom are actually the slave ships going on an annual basis. And I also was able to color code those as well. So green ships are going to Brazil, red ships are going to Cuba, and black ships are going to Sierra Leone. Why Sierra Leone? Because during this period, you have the abolition movement that's taking place, and I'll get into this a little bit later, but essentially the British are capturing slave ships, taking them into international courts and liberating the people on board. In many circumstances, they're creating lists of the people on board of these slave ships. So there's a lot of data that we can actually use. It's already in spreadsheets, it's already been accessed. Lots of different research and collaboration has informed the gathering of this data over the past 40 or 50 years. So as I was working with this data and I created these maps, I pulled in a team of mathematicians because we have numbers. We have the number of people who boarded the slave ships. We have the numbers of different towns and conflicts that are occurring at different periods of time. And so it's a lot of uncertain data, right? Because we're taking this information from oral traditions, from European travel expeditions, which are very finite lines that are traveling up during this period. But we have enough to be able to say that there may have been conflict in these regions. So it is an argument, right? It's my argument that I'm saying that conflict occurred at these places. Now, the primary sources don't assign specific dates to them, but the secondary literature over the past 60 years has been debating the chronologies of some of these places. So there are, of course, assumptions that I have to make because the data is very vague for the most part. Right? We're dealing with people who don't have written histories by choice. They have different forms of literacy, like Bata drums. But we also have tons of evidence related to the slave trade. We have tons of evidence of these cultures, like Bata, existing in Cuba, that are brought over specifically during the collapse of Oyo. So as I organize this into spreadsheets, I'm not going to get too much in detail with the data because I did this in the round bag lunch, but I'm able to show these progressions of conflict over time as they correlate to slave ship departures. So I think there's some meaningful information there, but this, again, is an experiment. And no one's done this before. It's sort of something you have to tease out a little bit. There's going to be mistakes. It's a representation. But that also leads me to really fear what I'm doing, because maps become very authoritative very quickly. So I'm very hesitant to say that this is absolute. You can't say that. But what it does is it helps facilitate understanding a very complex history that, quite frankly, not a lot of people know about, especially in the Americas, because there's so much uncertainty. So I can walk you through, I just started at 1824, but you can begin to see the different patterns of conflict that are beginning to take place at different periods of time. If you look closely at the maps, you can see the triangles, you can see the ships moving over time. And this is what really is driving all of these people to the coast. Now, of course, you have to keep in mind that to the north is this massive caliphate that's taking shape. So, of course, there's an internal migration that's occurring through all of this conflict. And this is really important because I think what we'll be able to do is almost reverse engineer some of the numbers of the slave ship departures to to figure out internal migrations. And so, especially into Sokoto, which was this massive state that was enslaving people through its expansion. So here are some of the formulas that my colleagues in applied math have come up with. I wish I could explain them, but that's not my skill set. What I can tell you is that we're really applying three parts of applied mathematics: Gaussian distributions, Markov chains, and something called kriging, which is to smooth over geographic mathematical data. So what this is essentially saying is that a Gaussian distribution is like a bell curve. My argument, my hypothesis is really that more people closer to the areas and zones of conflict are the ones who were put on slave ships, especially closer to the coast, where the ones further north probably went inland through an internal slave trade. So you can really begin to see those shapes that are taking place. Now the Markov chains are like a spider web. So a spider might take this path 20% of the time, but it might deviate its path to the center of the web So that's just representative of the different types of trade routes that they might be. Because of course, not everyone involved in conflict was enslaved. Not everyone put on a slave ship was involved in that conflict. So you have to take into all of these factors. But this is what mathematicians, statisticians really like, is sort of these uncertainty ideas. So they're really engaged with this project. We're going to be publishing some of this in a math journal based on the data that I generated. So when we're talking about math, we need proofs. Right? Where's the proof that these people are coming from? Unfortunately for this period and in this zone, we have what are the era of liberated Africans, right in the middle of it. And the liberated Africans are these people who were removed from slave ships. Now, liberated Africans is a very quotable thing because, of course, they weren't liberated. They were removed from slave ships, forced into contracts of indenture, and re-enslaved in another way. So these things would happen. They were taken to Sierra Leone. And these were all of the courts worldwide over the 19th century that led to the abolition of the slave trade. It was a big player in this. It's what really sort of started causing all of this after the Abolition Act of 1807. Now, because this is a major thing that Britain is doing, there's tons of information about this, tons of imagery. So here's the capturing of a slave ship. Here's another one. There's paintings of these things. We're talking about, maybe 1,200 cases worldwide. It extended into the Indian Ocean world in the later 19th century. People were liberated and taken to Freetown and then resettled in the Gambia. And for many circumstances, we can begin to trace these people. Burning of barracoons. So the cases I refer to are often the capture of a slave ship, but they're also, destroying slaving ports, liberating the people who are being held in barracoons along the coast, putting them on British ships and taking them to Freetown. We're doing this in the Caribbean, in Cuba. We're doing it in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, St. Helena, South Africa. And this was really a very big phenomenon that's taking place. So this is sort of my other digital project where I'm organizing these cases and all of these people. So I've counted up so here's some information. So I can show you more pictures, but here's, capturing of some dhows in the Indian Ocean world. Some liberated Africans from in the Caribbean. Here's just what Freetown looked like at that time. Here's where they would actually go through and register these people. So these registrations were complete passenger lists of the survivors of slave ships. They transliterate their African names, so they'd write down their African names. These weren't like nice things that they were doing. These are records of indentured servitude. Because after 14 years or 7 years, however long your indenture, you would have to go back to the authorities. They'd have to find you in these lists. So very difficult to prove even after 14 years. So these registers, which I'll show you in just a second, are very, very detailed. But this just gives you an idea of the process that was going around. We also have photography that starts coming out. So people like Samuel Ajayi Crowther. He was a liberated African. He became the first bishop of what is now Nigeria. So they're educating some of these people in different places. We also have some of the only photography of people removed from slave ships. So you can see the emaciated state. This is from East Africa. Actually, some criminals from Brazil who were liberated Africans. So you get mugshots. Because we have these registers, we're actually able to create very detailed records of a very large amount of people. It's from St. Helena as well. East Africa again. So these are the records that I mostly have to deal with in Sierra Leone. Wow. Right? So these are where some of the registers are kept. Through British Library and Endangered Archive programs run by different people have gone out and digitized a lot of these things. So I've been to Sierra Leone, but all of the materials I work with were digitized by other people. So what I'm really trying to do with liberated Africans is put all the cases together. And all of this, of course, is scattered out in numerous types of documentation, numerous volumes from all over the world. And they're all shuffled up, so I'm just putting the aces with the aces, the kings with the kings, queens with the kings, for about 1,200 cases. So it's quite a laborious process that I'm undertaking, and it requires a lot of collaboration as well. So here are what some of the registers of liberated Africans look like. So here's one from Brazil, for example. And so these are very detailed physical descriptions. You actually have branding marks put in there. So I have some colleagues who are starting to develop image recognition software to be able to trace slave ownership based on brandings and facial scarifications and other things as well. So this is all other projects that are going around with this incredibly important documentation. Here's one from Cuba. So you get these variations in documentation. So you can see their African names, the Spanish names they were assigned when they arrived. You get things like sex, age, height. They also, in Cuba, decided to assign nations to people, which you might be familiar with, things like Lukumi and Congo, other things as well. And here they have a full physical description of each individual. That hasn't been transcribed yet because we're talking about 100,000 individuals. We've transcribed the names, the age, the sex, and height, which is fairly fast, but very difficult. And then, of course, some of the interpreters who were involved in the process. So they actually had people in Cuba saying, you know, where are you from? And if they didn't speak a particular language, they change interpreters. And you can see it in the records when they do, because it corresponds to the nation and the interpreters. Here's some registers from East Africa. So remember those children of the photograph you saw on the ship? They did in each of those people individually as well. So we have all of this documentation that's slightly different, that's slightly the same. So a big interpretation was trying to figure out, through all of these global experts in these different regions, what our columns should be. And that took quite a long time to figure out how to develop a data set to accommodate the differences between the sources. So I've also been able to count out all of the liberated Africans as well. So you can see the periods of registration that are taking place. So they actually did a very good job in terms of all of the people that they were liberating, registering them. It's quite impressive the amount of work that was put into making sure these indentured servants were documented upon their liberation. You can also begin to break things down geographically, where they're leaving Africa by region. So this is a refined regional map of Africa that I've had to develop with some experts who I cited there at the bottom. This article just came out because I want to break up some of the differences between lumping together everyone from West Central Africa. You can actually, with these types of records, begin to parse things out differently. But when we think about the maps that I'm building, I'm just focused on this region here. And that's a very high proportion of liberated Africans who have been registered. We've begun to interpret their African names, looking at what languages were the African names. A Yoruba name is a Yoruba name. So you can see this in the records as you read out the names. We've begun to interpret all of this data so you can figure out almost ethno-linguistic compositions of slave ships with some of these records. So when I'm just looking at the Bight of Benin migration and those maps that I showed you, which is really from this period, we're dealing with these registers. Now here's the total trade during that period. So you can kind of project that out as well because it's a representative sample. So now I'm at the process of building a website called UW-Diaspora.org. This website is going to incorporate the maps that I'm working on, the mathematical formulas to show the probabilities of origins based on the conflicts that are taking place internally. And I'm going to be using the linguistic data from the registers, as we've already begun to do, especially with the Cuban ones, which is the focus of my dissertation research. But now I'm gathering everything from Sierra Leone as well. So what we have here In this particular ship, you can begin to really see the different the zones of conflict where they might be leaving, but this is all very far west to where the conflict that I'm interested in is actually taking place. But we still have people going that far away. And so here is an analysis of the African names. So you can begin to see that we have a small percentage coming from what would be Dahomey. We have areas that are coming from more in the Oyo territories, and then these brown are actually represented because people are, of course, coming further west. Here are the variations in trade routes that we can begin to figure out, because some of these liberated Africans provided narratives of their experiences. So sometimes the trade routes, people go north before going south. And we have various different ways in which we can create, through these Markov chains, different differences in trade routes over different periods of time. So the idea is, once we get all of this information going, we're going to run simulations, millions of simulations, to figure out those probabilistic origins. So the website, and I showed this in the brown bag, it's very difficult to present because it's still under development, but this is sort of representative of what it is. We're at a point right now where we have a sliding bar, can be presented online, that'll change the maps annually. I'm going to have clickable ships. So you could click on a ship, pull up this information, and begin to look at it. Extension, you could probably take these ships right across the Atlantic, start looking at where slave uprisings occurred. So you have things like the Mali uprising in Brazil in 1835, which was primarily participated by Yoruba Muslims. So we're going to know where some of these people might come from, even if we can't put them on a specific ship. We'll have these probabilistic ideas. In 1833, there's another major, less known Lucumí uprising in Cuba, involved about 400 people. A lot of these people would have come from this region as well. So we can begin to see these transatlantic connections a little more clearly in terms of origins. If you want to just do a quick comparison, I also want to put in clickable towns as well, because archaeology is really picking up. So we'll be able to, there's a lot of towns that are not on this map that are unnamed, because in archaeology we know that there's a place here. So I'm hoping to pull archaeologists in so that they can start to GPS different places that they knew existed, which no longer do. Call it town A, town B, town C, whatever you like, if it doesn't have a name. So again, you can begin to see differences between slave ships as well. Because here I'm just using the register for this particular ship. The names data really shows differences between the two different ships. I know that it's a Jebu and Oyo because these are the Cuban registers, and they had those nations. They were classifying people as Lucumí Oyo, Lucumí and Jebu. So you can begin to parse out what's going on each of these individual ships. So this is where I'm really beginning to think that there's a real possibility here. But again, I'm very fearful because of the authoritativeness that this presents. It really makes me worry, because what I'm basically saying is that Africans enslaved Africans, so any anti-reparations people are going to be very happy about that, which makes me a little apprehensive at the same time. So I just want to make sure that we're very clear that these maps are not perfect. The data won't allow it. But I think there's just enough there to be able to see what's going on in these different places internally within Africa. So as I just finish up this talk, if I can get this started. Has anyone seen this before?
Yeah. Showing my glasses.
So what's the problem with this map? Let me ask you all a question. What's the problem?
Political
What's that?
political boundaries.
Exactly. Right? This is a wonderful thing. Each black ship represents, each black dot represents a slave ship. This is all of the documented voyages that we currently have. But now once you begin to put in an animated map on top of it, What would be the potential? Even if it isn't perfect. What would that say about ancestry in the Americas? Could that inform where people came from and when? A little bit better than what we've been doing so far? And these are just things that I think about when I'm doing this. Because originally I just wanted to know where the drums came from. So this is a really powerful tool that is very teachable. It takes 2 minutes. You can start to see amazing different trends that are just completely tragic and appalling. You can see that the majority of ships are going to Brazil and the Caribbean, not the United States. You can see through this timeline. But what if you start putting in these animated maps? Would that inform? Can we click on every ship and pull out the documentation for researchers to verify the records themselves? Do we have to re-regionalize Africa to provide a better understanding of where people are coming from? So again, I do all of this just through the concept of experimentation, collaboration, working with different interdisciplinary techniques, geography, mathematics, and other things as well. So now we're approaching that period of oil. So now you can begin to imagine, at least for that little tiny quadrant of Africa, what's going on. And this is in the abolition period. This is when it became technically illegal. By now, oil has collapsed. But I do wonder what would happen if we did the rest of Africa. I probably can't do that. It's not within my wheelhouse. But I think there's a method here. I think I might be able to build a system that will really help. So if people wanted to generate more data, they could feed it into it. But if you build it, they don't always come. So I'm just going to end the talk there. I really appreciate you guys listening, and if you have any questions, please feel free to ask.
Henry, I have a question. First, just an observation. It's interesting to see how roughly with the development of cotton gin for about 10 years, you have this quick spurt of slave ships going to the southern United States. And it's just very, very quick, looks like about a decade. Mm-hmm. It starts and stops. But my question is regarding, to use an older language, about mode of production. And so I'm interested in, if you're looking at this process that unfolds after slaves have been transitioned from chattel slaves to indentured labor. And of course, it's going to vary by area, but I'm thinking comparatively now. For instance, the period that you focus on, the early 19th century, is also when, say, peasants in the Baltic states were transitioned from serfs, and of course there were some 10 categories of serfs, some of which were fairly close to being chattel slaves themselves, but how they were kept within existing modes of production. So for instance, the Baltic manors were retained, they didn't disappear. So with these former slaves, did they sometimes become tenant farmers? Did they, when replaced with indentured contracts, did they often stay within the existing plantation forms of agriculture? Or what kinds of mixes do you see? And over time, how does that change?
Great question. A lot of changes, depends on region. Mm-hmm. So Africanos Libres in Brazil, in a slave society that didn't abolish slavery until 1888. Same thing with Cuba, 1886. Mm-hmm. There's lots of documentation that they're actually treated worse than slaves. Mm-hmm. Because they don't have any access to the local courts or anything, because it's a whole new class of people. So in the same way of British emancipation in 1836, 1833. You know, this is part of the liberated African experience. So it's something I'm wrestling with right now. Do I count all of the emancipated slaves that happened after 1833 and the indentures that they did? And it's a huge restructuring of the world economy because of the Industrial Revolution, right? You know, as Dale Talmage and others and Zewski argue, you know, this is the period of second slavery where, you know, British essentially removes itself from the slave trade. Sugar in Cuba picks up because of the collapse of Haiti, coffee in Brazil, cotton in the South. You know, this is a huge transformative period that's taking place economically, you know, but it's also a huge period where all of a sudden, up until this point, slavery has just been accepted across the world. And now it's suddenly not. And it's this long transition to, you know, the era of abolition. But, you know, Mauritania was the last place to abolish slavery in 1981. And I just voted on removing slavery from the Colorado Constitution last election. You know, which has implication with prison labor in Colorado, where there's lots of private prisons. So
You must not have a gerrymandered state list.
I don't. I'm new to the state, and I'm from Canada, so it's crazy to me. But so yeah, I think there's, you know, it depends on time and place. You know, I think in Sierra Leone, you know, there's a lot of people were educated. Right? A lot of those became leaders. They went back to Nigeria. This is the oral traditions that I'm using for the maps. Are either the children of liberated Africans, like Samuel Johnson, Samuel Crowther, of course, explaining his experiences. So there's this whole relationship of where this information comes from with liberated Africans. I hope I answered your question, because it is of global in scope as well, because the world is going through this transition, and it's a long journey. It doesn't just happen in 20 years. We'll go back to me.
So thanks so much. That was a really inspiring talk. And I'm a historian of immigration and refugee movement. So I was thinking refugee. And then I was really fascinated by the slide where you said the first humanitarian courts. That's a beautiful and provocative claim. So I just want to hear you say like one more thing about it, because it was really suggestive and rich to me.
Yeah, but I mean, because of the concept that's happening, they're abolishing slavery. You know, they're really beginning after 1817. They've begun forcing the other slave trading nations to sign bilateral treaties. So they do this with Spain and Portugal, but they're actually paying them large sums of money to do it. So Great Britain pays Spain something like 400,000 pounds in 1817, and they go off and buy leaky Russian warships to go fight the American Wars of Independence. Now, of course, Spain had no interest in abolishing slavery, so they just wanted the money. So it becomes, these courts are bilateral, and they're supposed to be, you know, stopping the slave trade, but it really becomes Great Britain being the sort of the prosecutor, and the other nation being the defender. But these courts are international. They are trying to put an end to this trade. So there are scholars who do argue that this is sort of the beginning of these humanitarian courts, international courts of humanitarian effort. Now, they may not be perfect given the time period and everything, but there is a continuation, you know, right up into the Hague in a certain way.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
And then you had a slide that showed the amount of indentured servants and the documentation of them. And it seemed like it was pretty, that they documented most of them, and then they had a sharp decline. But it still seems like it was sort of average indentured servants. So what?
So in the,
It was a little before.
in this graph?
Yeah, so what happened that made them stop documenting?
In 1850 and 1855 in that area, just fluctuations in terms of what happened. So you have to think about this on an international scale. So Brazil stops its trade in 1856. So this is really what's happening is in 1840, St. Helena comes into the scene. And just before 1840, because of the legislation, Britain first started by only allowing, or the other nations allowed them to apprehend their ships only north of the equator. And then after 1839, different countries sign earlier, but Brazil signs in 1839 to be able to capture ships south of the equator too. And so this is really stopping the West Central African trade, which is the biggest of all the regions within Africa. So there's a lot of fluctuation that begins to take place, but essentially up until about 1850, and about this time, this is when Britain is starting to occupy places like Lagos. So they're beginning the colonial process at about that time as well. So they're starting to go in, occupy places within Africa. So they sort of, what you can begin to see with some of this data is that they kind of first do the Upper Guinea coast, and then they really start to shift towards Beta Benin, Beta Biafra, and then they systematically go over to the West Central Africa, and then curl around and start doing East Africa. So all of that stuff at the bottom is sort of the stopping of the Indian Ocean trade. Yeah.
I mean, it'll be, I think after Jeff's question, it'll be fascinating to kind of map out the capital flows of those times as well. But my question is very different. What was the secret language of the drums that you understood?
It's a secret. You know, there's a lot of, I mean, it's deep ritual knowledge. You know, it's really a lot of things that they discuss. You know, in Oyo, there's the Aroking, which are the royal drummers. They memorize king lists in certain circumstances. You know, so they convey stories of migration, cultural practices, a lot of praising to the gods, and so on and so forth as well. So there's, I mean, it's a wide range of thing that of course varies from drummer to drummer, but there is a systematic replication of the language. So, you know, it's very powerful. You know, I can't hear what it's saying because my Yoruba isn't good enough to hear the tones and everything like that, but I do know that it exists. And in Cuba, it's sort of, there's some variations because it's fused with Christianity and so on and so forth. So there's, you know, what they're doing is deep ritual knowledge, is sort of what my advisor would say.
But not necessarily related with the experience of slave ships or...
Well, those stories of migration are certainly expressed sometimes within this music. Certainly within Africa as well, so internal migrations. You know, Yoruba really function on Oriki Orinde, as sort of their ancestral heritage, like where people came from. So it's a different form of history that they're really thinking about. Yeah. No, yeah.
Can you speak a bit more? I'm completely outside your discipline, and I suspect that other people might be as well. But so apologies if this is redundant for those of you who like know a lot about African history. But I'm wondering if you can talk about. I mean, you mentioned this in your brown bag, and again here that your project is really in support of a broader claim about how Africans also enslaved Africans, and that this is in some ways an intervention into the way that we popularly, certainly outside the discipline, conceive of the way that the slave trade unfolded in, throughout history. And that this, because of the sort of taken for grantedness of maps as authoritative, this is part of your concern about the work that you're nevertheless doing. But can you talk about what's at stake in that for you, and maybe in the discipline as well? And along those lines, do you engage with that discussion elsewhere in your work, like as a way of trying to head off at the past some of the ways in which your work might be taken up to bolster those claims about the people who are anti-reparations?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that, you know, I think most people, when you're dealing with reparations, is really knowing that the history of the transatlantic slave trade was certainly one of the worst ever. Right? In terms of the types of slavery out there, I mean, there's a broad spectrum of slavery. Right? And that demand for enslaved labor from Africa, how the slave trade, how it drove, you know, African economies, expansions of kingdoms, collapses of kingdoms, you know, was really dictated more so by Europeans than within Africa, right? Because of this external influence that's constantly searching and supplying. So this is the major difference that I sort of see, that it's, you know, there's a byproduct to all of this, and it's a very complicated thing that I haven't worked out because it is so politically charged in this moment in time. So presenting this to an academic audience I really have no problem with that, but you know, the article, my maps was getting some publicity, and that started to worry me, right? Because the innovation of the maps, the way that they become authoritative. So if this suddenly gets pumped into the mainstream, that's where my concern is, right? Because that's not what I'm trying to do. I'm just trying to piece together where people came from. And I prefer people would focus on that, but because of our political environment right now, there's a concern.
And just to follow up on that as well, the way I was understanding your work at the Brown Bag again now is that this type of, the mapping you're doing of internal conflict within West Africa, I understood it to be essentially decoupled from the project, from the colonial projects that were underway, but what your answer now makes it sound like there were maybe colonial forces that were complicating or amplifying the conflicts that you're mapping.
Well, I mean, part of the colonial reasoning for colonizing Africa was for humanitarian efforts. You know, the Europeans started to say that, you know, Africans are enslaving Africans, so we better stop this. So we're going. That is, they don't acknowledge the 350 years of taking people across the ocean and millions of people. There's this overlap that's beginning, and I'm not a colonial historian, so now I'm being pulled into this history because there is an overlap, especially towards the end. You know, this goes into 1896. The Berlin Conference is in what, like 1886, where the European powers, without any African leaders, are just carving up the continent. So there's this overlap that's taking place, especially towards the end. And that's what I'm trying to flesh out right now as I get deeper into this longue durée of the liberated Africans.
It's a little pretty excessive. Just because there was like inland slavery happening, you think people are going to use that for like anti-revolution? Is that the sole thing, or am I missing?
I think so, because I think you know, anti-reparations people are very difficult.
But this information is already available.
Right.
So you would be, I mean.
Yeah, no, I know.
I can see your hesitation, but it's like information that's already like in all standard African history books.
Yeah. But I could just imagine
Well,
what
then
Fox
that's the
News would say.
fuel, you know, provide more data for folks. But you could interpret anything you say it anyway.
Right.
So they want to, they just use their click box.
And then I'd say I would just take a quote
Yeah, just,
out of context, as people like to do.
it's either like don't say anything at all, or, you know.
No, but that's why I'm doing it and publishing it, and,
Yeah.
you know, at the risk of the mistakes that I'm making. This is why I'm saying it's just an experiment. Let's wait a little bit longer to see what the results are. You know, what would the simulations say? Where are people coming? What are their probabilistic origins? Because what I really want it to be is something that, you know, people of African descent across the Americas might be able to use to figure out the complexities of all of these things, right? And the misrepresentation of Africa in the colonial period, pre-colonial period, right? That, you know, it's even the animated map at the end with the modern day boundaries is so problematic to me as a historian. Because these aren't people who are coming from Nigeria, it's what is now Nigeria, right? And there's a very big distinction in my mind for that. And so showing this, and the world is a different place back then, you know, totally different. Everyone's enslaving around the world. You know, and it's not like slavery has ceased to exist. I mean, there's more slaves now because of higher populations, but the percentages are lower. So it's a complex line that I suddenly found myself on just because of where we are now today.
A question about, you know, because we have this wonderful map library here at UWM, I've been looking at all the wonderful cartouches of monsters and exotic figures, right, often themselves racist in various ways. But I wonder if there's a way to visually represent on your map the kind of voracious colonial demand for enslaved people. Like, could you have a kind of monstrous Europeans, right? Is there some way to kind of address this, right? And visualize, in addition to movement, right, to visualize the economic flows and demands, right? To make, kind of build into the visual something that responds to this fear. Now, my second question is just about whether this is also a process within Africa of like encountering this past, right? Are African historians engaged in this kind of process of historical reconciliation, right? With who is in conflict with whom and what the outcomes of that were. Like are African historians also looking at these conflicts in various ways?
So to address your first question, well, I think the scale of the slave trade, that last video, I mean, I've seen it a million times. It's still disgusting. Each of those dots is representative of 600, hundreds of people at a time. And I think that's the monstrosity of it that really would show. But it's just showing sort of the internal conflict as this is happening. I think it's just, it would help us understand how these cultures formed in the Americas, the different threads of migration, and all of that. So, I mean, yes, you could throw a monster in, but then wouldn't I be doing what they do? And I'm just sort of thinking of that now, right? As throw this in. What, and just remind me quickly.
Well, yeah, are African historians also dealing with this, like, broad history of internal conflict contributing to
absolutely. I mean, conflict is ongoing all the time. Right? So, and that's something we have to, I think, wrestle with in terms of what's happening within this period and within these contexts, But so yes, I mean, and there's always revision going on in terms of when conflicts are happening, but we only have such a limited amount of sources for African, pre-colonial African history. And it's either going to be European, which has its own problems, or it's oral sources, which has its own problems, or it's archaeological. Right? So there's difficulties in really fleshing out when these conflicts were occurring, but we know a lot, right? In different periods and different regions within Africa, and people are constantly revising those interpretations. And this is just a medium that I'm using to interpret what I know. So these are, I really considered the maps that I'm making sort of my visualization. If someone else were to do it, it might be different. Using the same data. So I think there's a lot of difficult things.
Yeah, so I want to follow up on the question about reparations. And the question saying that we knew this, but also that I have a different question. The mapping just makes it so visual to people. So yeah, there's lots of data we know, and one of the dangers, I think, of a lot of digital humanities work is when people, I've seen this so in English there's a lot of corpus analysis, where people will take 5,000 or 100,000 novels, that is to say they would take the words that make up those novels and then do various kinds of queries to ask questions like what kind of, what words like appeared over time or what kinds of terms appeared together and so forth. And I've seen a lot of these that it's a little bit showman-like, where it's like, look at this pie chart or look at this graph, without a kind of, what I really appreciate, with the kind of modesty and acknowledgement that you make, that yeah, there's a bunch of assumptions here, and so forth. And I think that is really crucial, because too often the claims are just, you just see these amazing colored maps or graphs, and it's like, oh wow, but it's kind of mystified. So I really appreciate the way, how careful you are. But the question I have, which in a way relates perhaps to this concern about reparations, is what happens, like with that last visualization, what happens after they land? Because one of the interesting things to me was how few ships went to the U.S., but I imagine that not all the slaves that went to the U.S. came on ships that went to the U.S., that Caribbean ships, that there was further networks of transportation, for example, and also, markets at these ports. So I'm curious to know if anybody is doing that work, or I presume there are records and archives to do that kind of work as well. And I think that if one does that work and puts it with the kind of stuff you're doing about the internal African stuff, is that that's where reparations arguments can come back, because it's not only that people were brought from Africa here, and that even that Africans were enslaving Africans to send them here, but then white slave owners were buying them and selling, buying, selling, trading, etc. here, and that's where they get put actually into labor, and that's, so in a certain sense, you could, you know, perhaps counter that fear if you had those kinds of maps, you know, from that kind of thing.
So yes, there's tons of work being done in the inter-American slave trade, and that's all America. So there's a new component to the Voyages data set that is the intra-American slave trade database. So Greg O'Malley is really behind most of that, right? I mean, and Eltis with Greg O'Malley is really working. David Eltis is the creator of the Voyages database. And I'm also doing it with liberated Africans, because in many circumstances, as I mentioned, they're being resettled. So they end up in Cuba. I know most about it, Cuba, as well as Gambia. So they're liberating these people in Cuba, but the government is sort of responsible for them, and they don't really want to have to pay those costs. So following a cholera epidemic in 1833, they start resettling them in British Caribbean colonies, which are now experiencing a labor shortage because they've fallen out of the slave trade. So there's actually a high demand for, you know, places in Grenada, Jamaica, Bahamas, British Honduras, where they're actually asking for liberated Africans. So it's not fully like they're out of the slave trade, they're just doing it in a different format. They've kind of reconstituted the whole thing.
And then, so there are ships that would go to Charleston or go to New Orleans and things like that in order to slave market.
There's some evidence, but the thing, like one of the major differences between modern day slavery and old slavery, and especially in the slave trade, is that it was heavily documented because it was business and it was legal. But modern day, you don't find any documentation. So as soon as it starts becoming legal, people are eliminating that from, you know, you don't want a ship log that says I have 30 slaves on board in case you get apprehended. So there's this transition that's taking place. So things are becoming less documented throughout this process too. I mean, the last documented ship that we have taking enslaved Africans to the Americas lands in Cuba in 1866. But I can't imagine that there are ships after that, right? You know, it's not going to just end at that moment, especially when Brazil is abolished. Now, is there a record of that? No. But how much records of modern day slavery do we really have on paper? Right? There's signs to it, but it's not. So I wonder about that as well. It's because that's a major difference between the two.
So my question is really basic. I was wondering if you could say more about the use of the term pre-colonial, because I'm having trouble visualizing when was the pre-colonial, and are you saying specifically with relation to Africa? If
Yes.
so, to what extent can we see that in isolation from colonial projects that are actually enabling the slave trade and, you know, very much part of it? So just kind of parse that a little
Yeah, I
bit.
mean, in African history, we really have three main periods: pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial. It's a very easy, simplistic way to teach African history, to talk about African history. So when I'm saying pre-colonial Africa, it's really sort of before, and the debate of when that really started is, you know, there's a lot of different arguments. I mean, Algeria is very early in the 19th century. You have Liberia as well, which is quite early in the 19th century. And then things, you know, from the American Colonization Society, where they're sending people back. So it's again, I'm more of a pre-colonial. I'm looking at these states that are really operating without major European intervention, except for, in many circumstances, the slave trade with Europeans at the coast. Because they're not really, many circumstances, not many people go in that far, you know, depending on the region. So it's very complicated because I'm just dealing with this tiny quadrant, you know, so I can't speak freely about West Central Africa or up to the coast.
No, I'm just curious about if generally there's any sort of pushback against these sort of what seem to be very clear demarcations. I mean, I do post-colonial studies, and one of the perennial questions is when was the post-colonial government?
Right.
So when can ever be a post-colonial? So I think those are the kinds of questions sort of, you know, which I think are pre-colonial. I mean, when is that?
Yeah,
when
and
we're looking at the 18th century, I mean.
yes, I mean, it's just because it wasn't being colonized in this quadrant at this period, right? So it's just the terminology that we use within my discipline. that's very simplistic. But of course, there's scholars who kind of question that. You know, there's debates on over when it actually began, when it actually ended, and you know, in different places, different situations. You know, Ghana becomes independent before many other modern-day African countries. So, but we have kind of a general sense of that. And there's different ways to look at it. So, but it's in this we just call it pre-colonial for simplicity's sake, I guess. Yeah.
My question was about, still along the lines of this reparations concern. I'm thinking about the map's ability to say anything about causality with regard to the internal conflict. So you're showing like areas of conflict and, you know, kingdoms or whatever coming and going and all of that. But I mean, you can't, so if anyone could look at these maps and make the story about like these conflicts drove the slave trade versus the other argument that people made that the slave trade drove the conflict.
Mm-hmm.
But can your maps say anything about this, or the data that you have to create the map say anything to these questions of, you know, causality or mutual causality?
I absolutely think so. You know, I think, and this is something that I'm just getting to now because they're starting to have an impact. You know, and so it's, do I want to just throw this out there and say it's absolute? And that's why I'm just being very careful. Because that's not the point of my argument. Like, I'm trying to figure out when and where people came from,
Right.
when and where they went.
Right.
You know, I'm just trying to follow the drums, man, you know, and that's it. And so it's like, that's all I'm trying to do. But then there's this cause and effect that comes out of it that causes a bit of apprehension and making sure that I'm careful in what I'm saying in the discussion about it. And that's where I really wanted to, you know, that's just my apprehension right now. And you know, maybe if it was a different political climate, you know, but you know, there's certainly the distribution of wealth globally is a problem, and you can kind of see that. So it has an impact, but it doesn't, and so I'm wrestling with it. It's the bottom line.
Just to push on that a little bit, I mean, what kind of causality do you see as a result of the mapping that you've done?
I don't know yet. And that's, I mean, again, I'm just trying to figure out when and where people came from, inland, right? That was the initial outset, but now it causes these questions in my own mind. What is it that I'm doing here that could have implications and causalities, to use you guys' terms? You know, and that's where I'm just getting a bit hesitant as I move forward with this project. Is it something I want to be publicly online? You know, I look at, if you guys have seen nativelands.ca, I got this up in the brown bag. It's basically mapping out of indigenous territories over time and the treaties that they were forming. But it starts out with a big disclaimer that we're not dealing with land rights. We're just trying to figure out where people were located at different periods of time. And so, am I going to go with that approach? Because I'm still in a fluid stage of the development of this project. You know, as the brown bag, as some of you guys saw earlier today, I have, you know, some of the map already up online and developmental sites. So we have a sliding bar with the political maps and clickable. We started doing clickable ships. You know, and that's the point of it, but is it going to cause problems? And that's what I'm starting to wonder as this project develops further. Because do I need a disclaimer for this? I don't know. Yes, sir.
I have two questions. The first is pretty naive. What I learned was the triangular trade, right? Slaves to the Caribbean, rum up to New England, and then back again. And I didn't see that on your animated thing. I mean, this is what Richard was also mentioning. But the slaves had to get there by ships, presumably. I mean, the rum had to get there by ships, even if the slaves moved otherwise. So is it not on there because those aren't slave ships at that point? They're just rum ships?
Where
From the Caribbean up to the United States.
Well, first of all, the triangular trade is like a largely disproved model.
Right, okay.
I mean, people are going back and forth. There's a huge southern Atlantic trade that's taking place just between Brazil and West Central Africa, East Africa. So, I mean, I haven't gotten to the point where I want to follow these ships over and see what's happening in the Americas and the conflict that's occurring.
Okay.
So that's what I want to end up doing with it in some regard as well.
My second question might raise your anxiety a little bit more.
Right on?
So you mentioned, going back a little ways, you mentioned at some point you wanted to give these people now who have this African history but are in Brazil or whatever, you want to give them some idea of their heritage. So now that brings up the issue of genetics.
Yeah.
And that causes a lot of anxiety in everybody today. So I'm curious, I mean, it doesn't have to necessarily, but why don't you partner with 23andMe?
So I've actually, oddly enough, at the Anschutz Medical Center in Colorado, there's the director of the genetics lab there works on Eurogenetics. I reached out to her, we had a meeting, and I haven't heard back. Sometimes you want to do things interdisciplinary,
Sure.
but it just doesn't work out.
But that'd be a fact, I mean, obviously.
It's something we've been
something to think
considering,
about,
and it's something we've been talking about, but, how do you integrate some of that data? When you go on, I did 23andMe, because I just wanted to see, it came back that I'm clearly very white from Europe, and it's, but it's, even when you look at the maps, there's, they're talking about these genetics, and it's like Nigeria.
Yeah, right. It has its own problems.
It has its own problems because this is the modern day associations that people have,
Yeah.
and it's hard to even get them to think about what Africa might have looked like when no one was mapping it.
Yeah.
And that's sort of part of my objective too, is to be able to teach that. If I can only teach Oyo in a week, this is great. But you have inflow of boundaries, and you get that in a moment. It doesn't take long to figure that out. So there's that benefit of it too. But yeah, the genetics question, I think is very interesting as well. It's something we've considered as well. Yeah.
I wanted to ask a question about something you said early on. You mentioned your nervousness or your anxiety about how authoritative a map can become when it's digitized. And and for all the reasons that you've explained, there's just inherently a lot of uncertainty about this enterprise. And I wonder, how have you or how have others conveyed varying degrees of certainty in visual terms? One can obviously do it in a text, like this may have been the case, or if this is true, but and obviously filmmakers and makers of television have been figuring out how to convey uncertainty to viewers. I guess you could, what would like a Kurosawa Rashomon, a website, look like? Maybe you could create like 4 or 5 different possibilities and have the visitors to the website play around with the variables, and that would give them a sense of the range of possibility. And that would be interesting. And if the differences turned out to be not all that striking, maybe that would relieve your anxiety. But if the differences were striking, then just leave them out and create, the Rashomon website.
Right. A lot of geographic techniques, but what causes the anxiety really is that people get maps very quickly, and they may not explore the uncertainty behind it. They just might look at it and be like, oh, that's what it was like. Right? There's tons of animated maps that you can pull off the internet that I use for my classes just to illustrate, but I'm always very explicit in my explanations that these are very abstract, they're not really true, that I see lots of problems with them, but it gives you the general sense of what's going on. And if you're just going across that without really contemplating the uncertainty behind historical mapping, it's a problem. And I think geography, there's a division in the field in terms of people who want to do historical GIS versus people who don't. And so the historical GIS people I've spoken to, like Ann Kelly Knowles and others, there's different techniques, like not as linear boundaries, for example. So I tried to do that as best as possible on my maps and just kind of smooth so that there's not a firm line, because Africans didn't think of their territories so linearly as Europeans did. So I'm even bringing Eurocentric approaches into the map making, which again is another problem, right? So there's a lot of problems, but I think there's value at the same time. So it's that playing against each other. So but how many people are going to read an academic article? So these are just some of the questions that I'm at now.
Yeah, because the map gets shared on Twitter or Facebook, and, academic articles not so long.
Right. And then they get boiled down, and because I had an article in the Daily Camera at Boulder about this article that I published, just the political maps. And they didn't get OAO history right. And I didn't get a chance to review what they were going to publish. It just went out, and it was like, uh-oh. So, yeah.
You said some assumptions, like, in your method?
Mhm.
What kind of assumptions?
So because the data, where it's coming from, there's no dates assigned to it. So a lot of it comes from Samuel Johnson, who was the child of a liberated African from Sierra Leone and came back with the Church Missionary Society. And so he wrote what is sort of one of the most comprehensive histories about Oyo. So he's talking about Oyo from an Oyo-centric position. He only refers to the destruction of towns over a certain period. But then scholars since the 1940s, 1950s onward have been analyzing and debating that chronology. So some of the detailed assumptions that I make is that I'm just sort of, okay, here's a logical military progression, but we don't know if they jumped down and came back, or we don't know the order of destruction of places in many circumstances. So I have to assume those, but we know that it happens within a 2 to 3 year period. So to make it a little more exciting, I don't destroy them all in 1 year, I spread it out a bit, stuff like that, right? So what looks good to me is essentially what I'm presenting. But who's to say I'm right?
Just kind of follow on to that, and I think this is a question about specificity. The data points in the model are quite precise, albeit they're precise based on the assumptions, right? And don't necessarily correspond to the ways in which you talked about, like how Africans might have conceived sort of passage of time, right? Or time, I guess, in general. If you have these 2 or 3 years sort of eras or points in time, can you, I don't know how to think about this, but like, so for example, if there are people who were mobilized from a town during the conflict, right? Can we then figure out where they might have been, like what slave ships they might have been on, right? Over a 2 or 3 year period?
Yes, and I think that's the best
right
way to be
way
able
to
to
do
do,
it.
right? Is sort of say that, this particular ship consisted of people from this conflict zone at this particular time. And there's a lot of things you have to consider, like Rebecca pointed out earlier as well, like, just because the conflict's happening in 1826 and the ship is leaving in 1820, you need the travel times, and, so there's a lot of factors, and that's why the mathematics or probability can help with that, because that's what they really like, are these difficult conundrums that are not clear.
So I'm more familiar with the area slightly west, and more so with the late 18th century and early 19th century. But for the Gold Coast, there are so many Europeans writing about what's going on and the trade and what's going on in the interior, that it's very possible to know that Ashanti forces are invading this place, Dagomba, and then, 2 weeks later, there are some coffles of captive men, women, and children arriving at the coast, and they know that they were captives from that war, and they record, we sold 300 captives today to so-and-so, who's the captain of such and such ship. And you can very clearly connect specific wars with specific captives. I mean, not all of them, of course, but in the case of major conflicts, you can often document who was coming from where and which ship did they get on, and then of course follow the ship. And I'm getting a sense from you that
there are no records like that for this time and place? Is it because the British didn't have a permanent trading post anywhere along the Bight of Benin, or why don't we have anybody sort of reporting back to the Home Office what's happening?
That starts to happen sort of after 1836, a little bit more when British were certainly more preoccupied with occupying Lagos. But for the most part, no. I mean, the best we have is sort of, like Samuel Crowther's accounts that's documented many years later, reflecting back on his enslavement, or Samuel Johnson talking about his parents perhaps, but it's all very after the fact. But
The logs of the anti-slavery squadron ships don't talk about anything happening in the interior. They're just tracking ships.
They're just tracking ships.
People on the coast.
Yeah. So we don't really get. I mean, we have this one. I mean, the Clapperton and Landers who travel up right in the middle of Hoya's collapse. But it's just. I mean, they're just going up through a very narrow corridor where there's actually no conflict, and it's kept that way for parts of the slave trade. So they're seeing destroyed towns and they're remarking on those, but they don't know what's going on. They're just sort of, we need to find the course of the Niger River, and then they're going up through a major war, right? And they go all the way up into Sokoto, as you know, and it's all of, but they're just making firsthand observations as they trek along, and end up some of them dying inland and stuff, and it's it's very patchwork in terms of what we have, and that's a very narrow corridor, so everything to the east and west is just unknown within those records, because they're not asking about it or anything like that either. They're just, where's the Niger?
Exploring.
Yeah, discovering. Right?
So why don't we continue this upstairs on the 9th floor? We can migrate up there. We've got some food and beverage, and we can keep talking.
Thank you.